The church bells rang across St. Louis that winter night, their echoes fading into the empty streets. The air was sharp, heavy with frost, and the city seemed to hold its breath. Behind the old brick rectory of St. Matthew's Parish, a single light flickered through the back window, cutting through the mist that crawled up from the Mississippi. It was January 17th, 1982. Inside the church, a few candles still burned from evening mass. Father Samuel Harris had stayed behind, as he often did, to write his homily for Sunday. He was known for that, dedicated, kind, and impossibly patient with everyone who came through those doors. To the community, he was more than a priest. He was the one man who listened when no one else did. At 10:43 p.m., 12-year-old Peter Collins ran down the alley behind the church, chasing his dog, Duke. The dog darted past the rectory's gate, barking wildly. When Peter caught up, his breath froze in the air. The sight before him would haunt him for the rest of his life. Father Harris lay motionless near the stone wall, his collar stained dark against the snow. His glasses were broken beside him, one lens cracked like ice. Peter's scream echoed down the street, slicing through the quiet night. Police cars flooded the block minutes later, their sirens washing the church in red and blue. The small crowd that gathered whispered prayers, their faces pale under the streetlights. Nobody could understand how something so brutal could happen to a man like him. Detective Michael Donnelly led the investigation. A veteran cop with tired eyes and a smoker's cough, Donnelly searched the scene with quiet disbelief. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of robbery, just the silence of a place that should have been sacred. By dawn, news had spread across St. Louis. Parishioners arrived at the church steps, clutching rosaries, crying into their coats. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch ran the headline before noon: "Beloved priest found dead, community in shock." But behind the sorrow, something darker lingered. The diocese moved quickly to contain rumors. Officers were told not to speculate, reporters were kept outside the gates, and Donnelly's superiors urged him to handle the case delicately. In his notebook that morning, he wrote just one line: "Too many people want this buried." The bells of St. Matthew's tolled again that afternoon, their sound hollow against the winter air. For many, it was the sound of grief. For others, it was the beginning of silence. Years would pass before anyone spoke Father Harris's name again outside of prayer. The file was closed, evidence misplaced. Witnesses forgot details, or pretended to. St. Louis moved on, at least on the surface, but the truth never stayed buried forever. And as you listen to what really happened in that small Missouri parish, make sure you're here for the full story. Because the truth about Father Samuel Harris will turn everything you thought you knew about faith, loyalty, and power upside down. The morning light crept through the blinds of Detective Claire Matthews' office, cutting narrow lines across stacks of cold case files. The air smelled of old paper and burnt coffee. On her desk, the folder marked Harris Samuel. 1982 had been opened and closed more times than she cared to admit. Claire had spent 12 years in homicide, chasing killers who slipped through cracks the size of cities. But this case was different. It wasn't just another murder. It was the ghost of her childhood. Her father, Detective Michael Donnelly, had been one of the original investigators. He died before solving it, leaving behind only a box of notes and a silence Claire never learned to break. Her phone buzzed. "Matthews," she answered, her voice flat but sharp. "Lab just called," said Detective Grant, her partner. "They got a hit off that old cigarette butt from the Harris scene." Claire froze. That piece of evidence had been buried in storage for 40 years, sealed with dust and neglect. "You're kidding." "Nope. They pulled partial DNA. Modern analysis finally caught something. You might want to come down here." She stood slowly, the sound of her chair scraping against the linoleum. Her heart beat a little faster, not with excitement, but with something closer to dread. Driving through downtown St. Louis, Claire couldn't ignore how much the city had aged. Storefronts boarded up, graffiti under old brick arches. The same church bells she remembered from childhood rang faintly in the distance. Every sound seemed to whisper a name she hadn't spoken aloud in years: Father Harris. At the lab, a technician handed her a printed report. The name on the matchline was blurred under the fluorescent lights, but it wasn't one she recognized. Unknown male, mid-30s at the time, the text said. No record in CODIS until a few years ago. Prison intake. Petty theft, 1999. Died in custody 2 years later. So the suspect was dead. 40 years of waiting, and the trail ended with another corpse. Grant crossed his arms. That's the thing about ghosts, Claire. They don't talk back. She barely heard him. Then we find out who he worked for. Someone wanted that priest gone. Grant hesitated. You sure you want to dig into this? The department's fine, keeping the file where it is. Claire turned toward him. My father didn't die chasing nothing. There's something here, and I'm not letting it rot another 40 years. Back in her car, she opened her father's old notebook. The pages were brittle, the handwriting steady but tense. Near the end, she found a line underlined twice. They told me to stop asking about the church money. She leaned back, staring at the ceiling, the same question pressing against her chest that had haunted her father until his death. Who had the power to silence a city? Outside, the bells of St. Matthew's rang again. Claire listened until the sound faded, then whispered almost to herself, I'm coming for your truth, Father Harris. Rain fell softly over St. Louis, washing the streets in a dim orange glow from the old sodium lamps. The Mississippi moved slow and silent under the bridges, its dark surface reflecting the restless pulse of the city. Detective Claire Matthews parked near the corner of 9th and Pine, staring at the rusted steeple of St. Matthew's, rising through the mist like a memory she didn't want to touch. Inside the church, the scent of wax and damp wood lingered. Time had aged everything. The pews cracked, the hymnals faded, the confessional door creaking as it swung open. She could almost hear the echo of her own childhood footsteps. A voice broke the silence. Detective Matthews. An old man in a black cassock stood by the altar, leaning on a cane. His hair was white, his face pale but alert. I'm Father O'Leary, he said softly. I was here when Father Harris served. I suppose you're here about him. Claire nodded. I'm reopening the investigation. I'd like to ask a few questions, Father. He motioned for her to sit. The light through the stained glass fractured across his hands, trembling as he folded them. They never found who did it, he said. The police came, the press came, and then they all left, but we stayed, we had to. Did you know Father Harris well? A pause. As well as anyone did. He was a man of conscience. Too honest, maybe. There were things he wanted changed, things the church wasn't ready to face. Claire studied him. What kind of things? His eyes lifted toward the crucifix. Sometimes truth can destroy faith if spoken too soon. He knew that. There was something evasive in his tone, the same kind of fear Claire had heard in old interrogation rooms. Father, are you saying he had enemies? I'm saying he was loved, O'Leary answered, his voice trembling. But love turns bitter when it's betrayed. You'll find people who adored him and people who would rather he stayed quiet. Claire let the words hang. The old man's eyes darted toward the confessional, then to the door. It was as if even the walls could hear them. When she rose to leave, O'Leary called after her. Detective, she turned. There's something you should know, he said. A week before he died, Father Harris said he had a visitor, someone who wanted forgiveness but feared damnation. He said, when confession turns to threat, sin is no longer the worst of it. Claire felt a chill crawl through her chest. Did he say who it was? No. The priest's gaze dropped. And I didn't ask. Some things in the church were meant to stay buried. As she stepped out into the rain, Claire looked back at the church's dark windows. Buried. The word stayed with her like an echo from the past. Somewhere inside those walls, something had been sealed away, and after 40 years, it was starting to breathe again. The rain had turned to sleet by the time Claire reached the precinct. The air smelled like metal and winter. She hung her coat by the door and dropped a thick folder onto her desk. Across the cover, faded type read, Harris, Samuel, 1982. The file looked old enough to crumble under her hands. Grant leaned against the edge of her desk, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. So what did the priest say? Claire pulled out a stack of yellowed reports. That Harris had a visitor the week before he died, someone he called a threat, not a sinner. Grant frowned. A threat? That's vague. Everything about this case is vague. She flipped through the photographs, the body behind the rectory wall, the broken glasses, the cigarette butt that had finally given them a partial DNA match decades later. They found this photo in Harris's office, she said, holding up an image of a church charity event. But the man standing next to him, he's not listed anywhere in the parish records. Grant leaned closer. Could be someone the diocese didn't want on file. Claire didn't answer. Her father's handwriting filled the margins of several pages, neat, deliberate, underlined phrases like financial discrepancies and unaccounted transfers. Each note read like a man chasing something just out of reach. At the bottom of the final page, a single question in red ink. Why was the church paying the construction company directly? Claire's eyes narrowed. Look at this, she said. My father thought church funds were being diverted. St. Matthew's had renovations scheduled in 1981. The company handling it, Harlan & Sons Construction, had mob ties. Grant gave a low whistle. You're saying Harris might have found out? I'm saying he was a priest who didn't look away. She pulled out an old microfilm reel and loaded it into the machine. The glow illuminated her face as headlines flickered past. Local businessman linked to kickback scheme. Archdiocese approves expansion project. And then finally, priest found dead. Police investigating. The pieces didn't fit yet, but something in her gut told her they soon would. Grant rubbed his jaw. If there was money involved, that's motive enough. But it's been 40 years. Most of these people are dead or hiding. Claire looked at her father's final note. Too many people want this buried. She closed the file slowly. Then we start digging. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. The city outside was quiet, but inside the precinct, the hum of old fluorescents filled the silence. Claire stared at the wall of cold case photos, faces frozen in black and white, each one a story half told. Somewhere among them, Father Harris's eyes looked back at her, kind, tired, and knowing. She wondered if he'd realized, even in his last moments, that the truth he tried to protect would be his undoing. Outside, thunder rolled over the city, distant but growing. Claire whispered under her breath, "Let's see what you were trying to tell us, Father." The following morning, the air over St. Louis hung thick with humidity, even though winter hadn't yet loosened its grip. Detective Claire Matthews sat in her car outside St. Matthew's Parish, watching parishioners trickle out after morning mass. Most were elderly now, survivors of another time, their faces marked by years and secrets. She stepped inside once the church emptied. The confessional booth stood in the corner, its varnish faded, its edges worn smooth by decades of hands. Inside, it smelled faintly of dust and incense. She ran her fingers along the old wood, thinking of the words Father O'Leary had said the night before. When confession turns to threat, sin is no longer the worst of it. Her phone buzzed. Grant's voice came through, muffled but sharp. I've been digging through the evidence logs, found something odd. There's an unlabeled tape stored with the Harris file, marked only as Confession 1982. Bring it to the station, she said. An hour later, the two of them sat in the dim records room, a single desk lamp flickering as Grant placed the cassette into an old recorder. The tape hissed before a man's trembling voice filled the silence. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. The voice was low, nervous. I didn't mean for it to happen. They told me he'd understand, that he'd keep it quiet. But he wouldn't. He said he'd go to the police. A pause. Then the sound of the man's breathing quickened. You don't understand. I can't stop it now. If they find out I came here. The tape clicked off suddenly, as if someone had torn it from the machine mid-sentence. Grant exhaled. That's it. No name, no follow-up. Claire stared at the recorder. That's not just a confession. That's a warning. They reviewed the file logs again. There was no mention of the tape anywhere. Someone had deliberately hidden it. Could the voice be Harris's killer? Grant asked. Or someone who knew him, she said quietly. Someone terrified of what he'd become part of. The longer she sat there, the more her father's notes came alive in her mind. One missing tape, possible confession suppressed by clergy. He'd written it 39 years ago, he must have heard it too. Claire leaned back, her eyes fixed on the old recorder. This voice, and it's young, maybe late 20s. The fear sounds fresh, not guilt. Whoever this was didn't want to kill anyone. Grant rubbed his temples. So maybe Harris got caught in the middle of something bigger. Maybe that visitor came to him for help and someone made sure he couldn't give it. Claire didn't reply. Her gaze lingered on the tape. The faint, trembling words seemed to echo in the small room. "If they find out I came here—" Outside, thunder rumbled again. She pocketed the cassette, her resolve hardening. "Let's find out who you were confessing to and what you were so afraid of," she whispered. The next morning, the sky over St. Louis was a dull grey, heavy with clouds that promised rain. Detective Claire Matthews stood outside the Archdiocese building downtown, her reflection faint in the polished glass doors. Inside, the marble floors gleamed like mirrors, and the scent of incense hung faintly in the air, not from devotion, but from preservation. Everything here was meant to look untouched, eternal. She was met by a secretary who spoke in rehearsed politeness. "Archbishop Reynolds will see you now." Claire followed her down a long hallway, lined with portraits of past bishops, each one gazing down with solemn eyes. When she entered the office, the archbishop was already standing, his robe perfectly pressed, his expression that of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Detective Matthews," he greeted warmly. "It's been years since anyone's asked about Father Harris." "I'm reopening the case," she said, taking a seat across from him. "We recently recovered new evidence, an old confession tape that might be connected." Reynolds's smile tightened. "I wasn't aware the department was still pursuing that matter. It was tragic, of course, but long resolved." "Unresolved," Claire corrected. "His killer was never found." He clasped his hands, fingers adorned with a gold ring. "Father Harris was a good man, but sometimes good men find themselves in dangerous company. I'd advise caution, Detective. The past has a way of hurting those who dig too deep." His words weren't a threat, not exactly, but they carried weight. Claire leaned forward. "Is that what you told my father?" The Archbishop's gaze shifted slightly, the first crack in his composure. "Ah, yes. Detective Donnelly. A determined man. He came to me once, asking about church finances. I told him the same thing I'll tell you. The church's affairs are spiritual, not criminal. Then why did he write in his notes that you refused access to parish records?" Reynolds smiled faintly. "Because faith and law do not always speak the same language." Claire stood. "I'll need those records anyway." He rose as well, voice calm but firm. "Detective, I cannot permit that. The sanctity of the church must be preserved." Father Harris would have agreed. She looked at him for a long moment, studying the small tremor in his jaw, the tightness behind his tone. "You knew him better than most," she said finally. "Tell me something. Was he afraid before he died?" Reynolds hesitated. "All men of faith are afraid of something." When she left the building, rain had begun to fall, soft but steady. She walked toward her car, the Archbishop's words replaying in her head. "The church's affairs are spiritual. The sanctity must be preserved." Grant called just as she started the engine. "You all right? You sound tense." "Reynolds knows more than he's saying," she replied. "And he's protecting someone." "From what?" She watched the rain blur the city through her windshield. "Not what," she said quietly. "Who?" The storm from the night before had passed, leaving the city slick and shining under a pale winter sun. Detective Claire Matthews sat in her car across from the old parish school, its boarded windows staring back at her like hollow eyes. The place had been abandoned for years, but according to archived records it once handled the bookkeeping for St. Matthew's Church. If there were money trails or secrets, this was where they started. Grant arrived a few minutes later, holding 2 coffees and a thin smile. "I checked Harlan & Sons Construction," he said. "You were right. The company folded in '84. But before that, they won a surprising number of contracts from the Archdiocese. Renovations, land development, even a parking lot that was never built." Claire took the cup, her mind already turning. All paid with parish funds? Every dollar, Grant said, and every record signed off by the same priest, Samuel Harris. She frowned. That doesn't make sense. Harris wasn't the kind of man to sign off on something crooked. Maybe he didn't know, or maybe he found out too late. They went over the old ledger pages Grant had printed, numbers that didn't add up, checks signed under duress, and a string of unexplained withdrawals that matched the months before Harris's death. Claire tapped one entry with her pen. This payment here, it's not a business. It's a front. St. Louis Outreach Initiative. It's supposed to be a charity, but the address doesn't exist anymore. Grant leaned back, shaking his head. So where did the money go? That's the question that probably got Father Harris killed. As they packed up, Claire's phone buzzed. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. A man's voice came through, low and uncertain. Detective Matthews? Yes, who's this? You don't know me, but I know about the church, about what happened. Claire's pulse quickened. Go on. I can't talk on the phone. They still watch. Meet me where it started. The old parish garden. Tonight. The line went dead. Grant stared at her. You think it's legit? Maybe, she said. Or maybe it's a trap. But if someone still cares enough to warn me, it means the story isn't finished. That night, as the sun disappeared behind the arches of the bridge, Claire returned to the garden behind the rectory. The earth there was uneven, patches of grass giving way to dirt. She stood where the body of Father Harris had once been found. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Too many people want this buried. She crouched, brushing away the damp leaves. Beneath them, something metallic caught the faint light, the edge of a rusted nameplate. It read, Harlan and Sons, Property Line, 1982. She straightened slowly, her breath visible in the cold air. Every trail, every secret, kept circling back to the same place, beneath the church itself. And now, someone else knew she was looking. The next day, the cold came early. Frost clung to the edges of the precinct windows, and the light that filtered through was thin, almost colorless. Detective Claire Matthews sat hunched over her desk, a magnifying glass in one hand, the faded photograph of Father Harris in the other. She'd looked at it a dozen times, but now her eyes caught something she hadn't seen before. A reflection, small and distorted in the window behind the priest. A face. She enlarged the image on the computer, adjusting the contrast until the figure came into view. It was a young man, early 20s maybe, wearing a clerical collar but standing apart from the others. His gaze wasn't toward the camera, it was on Father Harris. Grant stepped up beside her. Another priest? Maybe, but he's not in any parish records, I checked. Claire zoomed in further. He's got a name tag, she said. Adler, Tom Adler. Grant flipped through the notes. Thomas Adler. Here we go. Seminary student ordained in 83. Went missing a year after Harris's death. Never found. She leaned back, her pulse quickening. That can't be a coincidence. Could be he ran, Grant said. Priests disappear sometimes. Transfers, new names, new lives. Claire shook her head. Or he saw something he couldn't live with. They went through the archives again, newspaper clippings, church bulletins, diocesan newsletters. Adler's name appeared only once, listed as assistant to Father Samuel Harris for less than 6 months. After that, nothing, no transfers, no obituary, no trace. Claire closed her father's notebook, now filled with sticky notes and highlighted lines. He mentioned a witness too scared to speak. This could be him. Grant looked doubtful. After 40 years, even if he's alive, he's not talking. I'll find him, Claire said. If he's still breathing, he knows why Harris died. She spent the afternoon calling parishes across Missouri, then Kansas, then Illinois. Every lead ended the same way. Silence, confusion, or a polite refusal to comment. But near sunset, a retired parish clerk finally picked up. Tom Adler, the woman repeated. Oh, honey, that boy was trouble. Came here in 82, said he was looking for redemption. Next thing we knew, he vanished. Heard later he'd changed his name. Kansas, maybe. Claire jotted every word. Do you remember what kind of trouble? A pause, followed by a sigh. He got mixed up with the wrong people. Construction folks. The same ones who were always around Father Harris before it happened. When the call ended, Claire sat still for a long moment. The office felt smaller, quieter. Grant's voice broke the silence. So, we've got a missing seminarian, mob-connected contractors, and a murdered priest who signed checks he shouldn't have. Not missing, Claire said softly. Hiding. She turned back to the photograph, the young man's eyes frozen behind Father Harris. The longer she stared, the clearer it became. Fear had already found him, long before the night Harris died. The Kansas highway stretched flat and endless beneath a pale horizon. Detective Claire Matthews drove with the radio off, the hum of the engine her only company. Every few miles, an old church spire or a rusted grain silo broke the monotony of the land. According to the records she'd unearthed, a man matching Tom Adler's description had been living in a small town just outside Topeka for more than a decade, under the name Thomas A. Keller. By the time she reached the address, the light was fading. A small farmhouse sat at the edge of a frozen field. Smoke rose from the chimney, a sign of life. Claire parked at the end of the gravel road and walked up slowly, the crunch of her boots loud against the quiet. A man opened the door before she could knock. He was in his 60s now, face lined, hair silver at the temples, but the eyes, wary, searching, were unmistakable. "Mr. Keller?" she asked. His jaw tightened. "No one's called me that in years. Then what should I call you?" After a long pause, he sighed. "You already know." Inside, the house was modest but neat. Old books lined the shelves, and a single crucifix hung above the fireplace. Claire noticed the faint tremor in his hands as he poured coffee. "You were there," she said quietly, "at St. Matthew's. You worked under Father Harris." He nodded, eyes fixed on the table. "He tried to protect me. I didn't deserve it." "What happened, Tom?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. "They were using the church, Detective. Construction deals, fake charities, money funneled through parishes like ours. Harris found out. He said it was wrong, said he'd go to the police. But that meant exposing people far above his rank, men with influence, power, and friends in both the city and the clergy." Claire leaned forward. "Who were they?" "I don't know all their names, but I know who ordered it stopped." "Stopped?" Tom's eyes filled with a haunted light. "He called me to the rectory that night, said he needed to see Father Harris immediately. I waited outside, but I heard shouting. Then, silence." Claire's pulse quickened. "Who?" Tom hesitated, his voice breaking. "Archbishop Reynolds. He told me later that it was handled, that Harris had brought shame to the church, and that silence was mercy. He told me if I spoke, I'd be excommunicated or worse. Did you record your confession back then?" Tom nodded slowly. "I thought if I left proof, the truth might surface someday, but I was young, scared, I ran." He looked at her with a sorrowful smile. "I've carried that sin longer than my faith. You think finding the truth will bring peace, but it won't. Not here." Claire stood, her heart pounding. "Maybe not, but it'll bring justice." As she turned to leave, Tom's voice stopped her. "Be careful, Detective. Reynolds isn't the only one who wanted this buried. The church isn't the only place that keeps its secrets." Claire returned to St. Louis with the weight of Tom Adler's confession pressing against her chest like a secret too heavy to carry. The drive felt endless, the Kansas plains giving way to the dense hum of city lights. By the time she reached the precinct, night had swallowed the skyline and the air was sharp with the first hint of snow. Grant was waiting by her desk, a folder in his hands. "I ran that DNA sample again," he said. "The one from the cigarette butt found near the rectory. It's a match to a man named Joseph Kearns." Claire frowned. "Never heard of him." "You wouldn't have. He worked as Archbishop Reynolds' driver back in the 80s, served time for assault in the 90s, died in a Missouri prison 3 years ago." Her mind raced. "So the Archbishop's driver was at the scene the night Father Harris died." Looks that way. But if he was covering for Reynolds, it explains why the file vanished. Claire sank into her chair, rubbing her temples. Reynolds told me the church's affairs were spiritual. That was his way of saying untouchable. Grant hesitated before sitting across from her. You think he gave the order? I think he's been hiding behind the collar for 40 years. She opened her notebook and began sketching out a timeline. The fake charities, the construction deals, the missing funds, the night of the murder. Every line led back to one name, Reynolds. But the connections were still circumstantial. She needed proof, something undeniable. I want to see Kearns's prison records, she said. Visitors, correspondence, anything. 2 hours later, Grant returned from archives, tossing a thin report onto her desk. He didn't get many visitors. Just one, actually. A church official named Father O'Leary. Claire froze. O'Leary? Yeah. You talked to him, didn't you? The old priest from St. Matthew's. Her pulse quickened. He told me some things are meant to stay buried. Maybe he wasn't talking about the past, and maybe he meant the people still keeping it that way. Grant frowned. You think O'Leary's protecting Reynolds? I think he's been living with guilt for decades, and guilt makes people do strange things. The realization hit her like a sudden chill. O'Leary had access, opportunity, and every reason to obey the man who still held power over him. Claire stood, grabbing her coat. If Kearns took the fall, someone made him. And that someone's still alive. Grant looked uneasy. You're going back to the church? Not yet, she said. First, I want to know why O'Leary visited a convicted felon tied to the Archbishop's personal staff. That meeting wasn't spiritual. It was business. As she stepped into the hallway, the sound of the city outside seemed distant, muted, like the quiet before a storm. Every step brought her closer to something she could feel but not yet see. Behind all the lies and lost records, one truth lingered. The man in the shadows had never really left. The church was quiet that night, its silence heavier than prayer. Detective Claire Matthews stepped through the arched doorway, her footsteps echoing against the marble floor. The only light came from the altar candles, faint, trembling, as if afraid of what they illuminated. Father O'Leary stood near the confessional, his hands folded, eyes fixed on the crucifix. You came, he said without turning. I had to, Claire replied. We need to talk about Joseph Kearns. His shoulders stiffened. That man's been dead for years. But not before you visited him in prison. Twice. O'Leary turned slowly, his face pale. You've been busy. I know Kearns worked for Reynolds, she said, and I know you were his intermediary. You've been covering for him since the day Father Harris died. The priest took a shaky breath. You don't understand, Detective. The church, and it's built on obedience. We take vows. Sometimes those vows mean silence. Silence doesn't absolve murder. O'Leary's gaze broke for the first time. You think I don't know that? I've lived with it every day. Then tell me the truth, Claire said. Tell me what really happened that night. For a long moment, only the ticking of the old clock filled the space between them. Then his voice came, low and trembling. Harris discovered that money was being funneled from the diocese to criminal fronts. He confronted Reynolds, not in anger, but in faith. He thought he could appeal to his conscience, but Reynolds, he wasn't a man of conscience anymore. O'Leary's hands began to shake. I was there, Detective. I heard them arguing. Harris threatened to expose him, said the church couldn't be built on lies. Reynolds told him he'd destroy everything if he spoke. When Harris turned to leave, Reynolds struck him. He didn't mean to kill him, or maybe he did. I don't know anymore. Claire felt her throat tighten. And you helped cover it up. Tears welled in his eyes. I buried the truth the same night we buried him. Reynolds ordered me to call the police to tell them Harris had been attacked by an unknown assailant. He said the church would handle the rest, and I obeyed. Why? O'Leary's voice broke. Because I believed him when he said it was for the good of the church. I thought one man's silence could save 1,000 souls. But I was wrong. Claire stared at him, a mix of anger and pity twisting inside her. You let an innocent man's death go unanswered for 40 years. He nodded, tears slipping down his face. I know. and every night I pray for forgiveness. But now you've come, and maybe this is God's answer, the truth finally speaking through someone who isn't afraid to hear it." Claire stepped closer, her tone soft but firm. "Then help me finish this. Tell me where the proof is." He hesitated, then whispered, "In the archives below the church." That's where Reynolds kept everything he didn't want found. As Claire turned toward the door, O'Leary's voice followed her. "Be careful, detective. The truth has already killed once." The air beneath St. Matthew's was colder than winter itself. The old archive room smelled of dust and mildew, a tomb of forgotten truths. Detective Claire Matthews followed the narrow stone corridor with a flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. Each step echoed like a whisper from the past. Father O'Leary's words replayed in her head. That's where Reynolds kept everything he didn't want found. Metal shelves stretched along the walls, lined with decades of ledgers, records, and sealed boxes, stamped with the crest of the archdiocese. She stopped before a rusted cabinet, its lock broken long ago. Inside were files marked "Confidential, 1982. Her hands trembled as she opened one. Photocopies of checks, transfer authorizations, and internal memos spilled out. A paper trail linking church funds to construction fronts controlled by the same shell companies her father had investigated. Every document bore the same signature at the bottom, Archbishop Edward Reynolds. Her breath caught. It was all here. The corruption, the cover-up, the motive. Grant's voice crackled over her phone. "You find anything?" "More than enough," she said quietly. "He paid them off, Grant. Harris found out and threatened to go public." Reynolds silenced him. A pause. "You sure you're safe down there?" "I'll be fine," she replied, though her heart was pounding. She gathered the files into a folder, tucking them under her arm. But as she turned to leave, the faint sound of footsteps echoed behind her, slow, deliberate. Claire froze. "Father O'Leary?" No answer. Only the sound of breathing, faint but close. Her flashlight flickered, then steadied. A shadow moved across the far wall, tall, deliberate, familiar. Claire gripped her phone tighter. "Who's there?" The silence stretched until it broke under the sound of retreating steps. She followed them back up the narrow staircase, every instinct screaming that she wasn't alone. When she reached the main floor, the church was empty, but the front door hung slightly open, wind pushing through the gap. Whoever had been there was gone. Later that night in her apartment, Claire laid the evidence across her table. The glow from the city outside cut across the papers like blades of light. She opened her father's old notebook one last time, flipping to the final page. There, in faded ink, was a note she'd never noticed before. "Truth is heavy. Some will break under it." Her phone rang again. Grant. "The department's not happy," he said. "Reynolds has friends in high places. They're already trying to bury this." "Let them try," she answered. "I've got copies of everything." "Claire," he hesitated. "Be careful. If Reynolds feels cornered—" "I'm counting on it." She hung up and stared at the document spread before her. The weight of it pressed down, but beneath the exhaustion was something new. Clarity. For 40 years, silence had ruled over St. Matthew's. But now, finally, the truth had a voice. By morning, St. Louis was awake with noise, sirens, traffic, and headlines that couldn't be contained. The Post-Dispatch ran the story first. Archdiocese under investigation, decades-old murder reopened. Within hours, national outlets followed. Reporters surrounded the church, microphones flashing like fireflies. Detective Claire Matthews stood on the courthouse steps, her expression calm but resolute. The documents she had uncovered, bank records, letters, and sworn statements, had been turned over to the state attorney. It was enough to open a formal inquiry, enough to drag 40 years of silence into the light. Grant joined her, holding 2 coffees. "You did it," he said. She shook her head. "Look." "Not yet." Inside the courthouse, Archbishop Reynolds sat at a long wooden table, flanked by lawyers in dark suits. His expression was composed, almost serene, as if the chaos around him didn't apply. Across from him, Claire watched in silence as the prosecutor began the questioning. Archbishop, these records show you authorized multiple transfers of parish funds to accounts controlled by Joseph Kearns and the Harlan Construction Group. Do you deny this? Reynolds smiled faintly. The church conducts many financial dealings. To suggest corruption based on incomplete documents is irresponsible. And what about the night Father Samuel Harris was killed? The prosecutor continued. You were seen arguing with him hours before his death. I have no recollection of such an encounter, Reynolds replied evenly. Claire leaned forward. Then how do you explain his blood on your driver's cufflinks? The room fell silent. The evidence, preserved in storage for decades, had matched DNA from the rectory. The faintest flicker of tension crossed Reynolds's face before his attorney objected. The hearing continued for hours, each question peeling back another layer of deception. The Archbishop's answers grew sharper, his composure thinning. Finally, Claire spoke directly. Father Harris was going to expose you. You silenced him to protect your empire, and you made good men carry that guilt for the rest of their lives. Reynolds turned to her, his voice calm but venomous. Detective, you speak of faith as though you understand it. You don't. You see sin where there was only sacrifice. Sacrifice, she repeated. You killed a man who believed in the truth. His eyes narrowed. The church has survived greater storms than you. People forget and the faithful forgive. Claire met his gaze without flinching. Not this time. Outside, reporters crowded the steps as word spread. Archbishop Reynolds had been indicted on charges of obstruction, fraud and complicity in the death of Father Samuel Harris. Cameras flashed, questions flew, and for the first time in 4 decades the church's veil of sanctity cracked. Grant looked at her as they pushed through the crowd. You think this changes anything? Claire exhaled, her breath fogging in the cold. Maybe not the church, but it changes the truth, and that's enough. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, the bells of St. Matthew's began to toll, slow, deliberate and mournful. For once they didn't sound like sorrow, they sounded like justice. The rain began just after dusk, a slow, steady rhythm against the city that seemed too quiet for all it had endured. Detective Claire Matthews sat in her car outside St. Matthew's Parish, watching water trace crooked paths down the windshield. The trial was over. The verdict had been swift. Archbishop Edward Reynolds, guilty on all counts. But he never lived to hear his sentence. 2 nights earlier, before his transfer to federal custody, he had collapsed in his holding cell. Heart failure. The official report called it natural causes. Claire didn't believe in that kind of coincidence anymore. She stepped out into the rain, her coat soaking through almost instantly. The church bells tolled softly in the distance, the same bells that had rung for Father Harris 40 years ago. The same bells that had echoed through her childhood home, long before she understood what her father was chasing. Inside the gates, the small cemetery behind the rectory waited, silent and slick with rain. Father Samuel Harris's grave stood beneath an old oak tree, its branches trembling in the storm. Claire knelt, her knees pressing into the wet earth. I found him, she whispered, and I found the truth. The words sounded smaller than she expected, almost fragile. She brushed away the leaves that had gathered on the stone, tracing the engraved letters with her fingertips. Samuel Harris, 1943-1982. A shepherd of truth. Lightning flashed above, and for an instant the world was white. The thunder followed, rolling like a slow confession. She thought of her father, the late nights, the unanswered questions, the obsession that had driven him until the day he died. He'd spent his life hunting the truth but never reached the end of it. She had. And now that she was here, the victory felt heavier than the silence that had preceded it. A voice broke through the rain. You really did it. Grant stood a few feet away, his jacket dripping, his face shadowed under the brim of his hat. He approached quietly, respectful of the moment. She deserved justice, Claire said, her voice hoarse. So did your father, Grant replied. He'd be proud. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The rain softened to a mist, and for the first time in months she felt her breath come without effort. The truth had cost lives, faith, and innocence, but it had also freed something, in her, in the city, in the people who had chosen to believe again. Grant looked toward the church. They're reopening St. Matthew's next week. New priest, new congregation, fresh start. Claire gave a faint smile. Maybe that's what redemption looks like, not forgetting, just starting again. He watched her for a moment, then turned to leave. You coming? In a minute. When he was gone, Claire stood beneath the oak, rain running through her hair, and whispered one last promise. You can rest now, Father Harris. The truth finally found the light. The bells tolled once more, not in mourning this time, but in peace. 1 year later, spring had returned to St. Louis. The city breathed easier now, the grey of winter replaced by soft light that spilled across the streets like forgiveness. Detective Claire Matthews stood outside St. Matthew's Church, watching the small crowd gather. The church had been restored. New paint, repaired pews, a rebuilt garden behind the rectory. But the air still carried something older, something sacred. Inside, the bells began to ring. Their sound rolled across the neighborhood, rich and steady, calling people home. Claire walked through the doors, nodding politely to parishioners who recognized her from the newspapers. The investigation had made her name known, but notoriety wasn't what she'd fought for. She came for something else. Closure. At the altar stood Father James Donovan, the new priest appointed to lead St. Matthew's. His voice carried warmth as he spoke. Today we rededicate this parish in memory of Father Samuel Harris, a man who believed that truth, even when painful, brings us closer to grace. Claire listened quietly, her hands clasped in front of her. His words felt right, not rehearsed, not political, just honest. After the service, Father Donovan approached her. Detective Matthews, he said kindly, it's an honor. Your work gave this church back its soul. She smiled faintly. I think Father Harris did that. I just uncovered what he started. He nodded. The truth has a strange way of surviving, even when people try to bury it. Outside, the crowd mingled in the courtyard, laughter and conversation replacing the decades of silence that once hung there. Children ran across the grass, their voices bright against the afternoon air. For the first time, the church didn't feel haunted. Grant arrived late, 2 coffees in hand as always. You actually came, he said, handing her one. Would have felt wrong not to, she replied. He leaned against the stone railing. You ever think about taking a break? Maybe something quieter than chasing ghosts, Claire smiled. Maybe someday, but not yet. He chuckled. Figures. You'd get bored with peace in a week. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sunlight reflect off the stained glass windows. The colors danced across the stone like pieces of the past finally fitting together. Claire looked toward the bell tower. You know, when I was a kid, my dad used to say those bells sounded like truth, that no matter how long it took, truth always rings loud enough for someone to hear. Grant followed her gaze. Guess he was right. She nodded slowly. Yeah, he was. The bells began to chime again, slow, deliberate, but filled with something new. Not mourning, not warning, just life continuing, one toll at a time. As the sound filled the air, Claire turned toward the street, the faint smile still on her lips. The story was over, but its echo would remain, not in sorrow, but in remembrance. And somewhere, in the rhythm of those bells, St. Louis remembered too.